So thank you for the invitation to speak. It's just loading here. So just to briefly summarize this presentation, so the intention here is to start a more critical conversation about what justice is and what we mean when we're talking about justice. I think a lot of people in this room and at this conference are really passionate about the ideas of justice and injustice towards human and non-humans. So I think it's really crucial that we understand what we mean by when we're talking about justice, as well as the entire process for how we're going about achieving justice. So just as I begin, I think it's important just to recognize that to provide a land acknowledgement for the people of Karen Nank, it's Karan Kawa and Eko Kisa, so traditional caretakers of the territory before settlement and colonization. And I think land acknowledgements like this are important because we're here talking about rights, liberation, about justice, and I think we need to really be aware that this is happening on stolen lands where people have been displaced through historical and ongoing processes that have been very violent and oppressive. So just getting into it, defining justice, I think it's important to first think about the idea of harm. So when we're talking about justice, trying to recall just right now for a few seconds both the time when we have experienced harm and when we have committed harm. So just recalling something like that and thinking about how they relate and how they differ. And so the point with that is that just again to be really mindful that we all create harm in different capacities and different degrees. And sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. That, if we're essentially living on societies like this, we're going to be creating harm or at least be extremely complicit in different degrees. So I think that's really helpful just to remember as we're trying to talk about these issues. And I think this quote from Malcolm X summarizes this really well, is that, I'll read it off for you, "Don't be in such a hurry to condemn a person because they do not do what you do or think as you think. There was a time when you didn't know what you know today." So I think that's a really great concept just to keep mindful of. Okay, so I'll be talking about retributive justice. And just an asterisk, a lot of my research has been Canadian focused, so it's going to be from a Canadian background. So the background of retributive justice, it's very similar to the United States. So it's the law and order system, or the criminal justice system. The last presentation was touching on some elements of this. So the idea here with the retributive model is that it's extremely punishment based. So when we define harm by breaking policies or laws, and when we understand harm as these crimes, we look towards the offenders of these rule breakers and punishing them accordingly. So there's a lot of emphasis on harming offenders in a way that deters others from doing these things. And so with this retributive model, we have a lot of institutions of power, like the police and the courts and the prisons. So in practice, we have a lot of punishments, essentially. That's essentially what the justice system is a lot of punishments. The Canadian Criminal Code is an extremely thick book, just listing punishments after punishments. And so with this model in practice, it really serves to uphold and perpetuate a lot of the systems of oppression that exist in society elsewhere. It's very self-serving of the status quo. And so in the results of the retributive model, both in the United States and Canada, is that we have societies now where it's really hard to get out of viewing harm as not defined by laws and policies. And as well, when we view harm, we don't put sole attention on perpetrators, offenders, as the primary person to be looking towards. As well, it's really important just to recognize how much resolutions to harm, we almost unquestionably just assume there needs to be punishment, and that's the driving route for solutions to harm. So bringing this to talking about animal liberation, animal justice, asking ourselves, is this retributive model in the United States and Canada, is that something that can help us? So with that, I think it's really important to ask ourselves, is our goal to be punishing animal abusers? And if we think so, how do we even begin to punish the system of animal abuse where it's so ingrained? How do we punish something like that? And with questions like that, we should ask, is it still harm if there's no law? So cases like testing labs where it's animal testing, there's no laws against that, but a lot of people view that as extremely harmful. As well, if there's laws, does that make it harm? Like the egg law, where there's laws now that criminalize certain behavior, but a lot of animal activists and others would say that actually we're trying to relieve harm by bringing more attention towards really disgusting, awful things. So, from my research in Canadian focus, animal cruelty, just to summarize what I think it's extremely problematic and very limited version of justice. So, Canadian Criminal Code, it has not been updated in over a century. 1892 was the last time. And animals, when we're talking about animal abuse, animal cruelty, animals are defined under the property clause, so they're understood as property. So beyond the ideas of willful neglect, unnecessary harm, which are really limited and vague wording, so it's very hard to convict people. The perpetrators, again, the focus is on the perpetrator, the criminals. Perpetrators are understood as property owners, so it's really hard to imagine how there's any result of justice when we have stuff like this, when we're looking at criminals or perpetrators as property owners. And it's also really important to note, too, within the Canadian Criminal Code, that punishments vary according to an animal's property value. So they call them working cattle in the code. So working cattle isn't like cows have higher penalties because their capital value is higher. And so it's just interesting to note that there's so much capitalism ingrained within this version of justice where animals of higher status are going to bring about more punishment. As well, looking at prisons, asking ourselves, prisons are really fundamental to the retributive model, and asking, do we think prisons are going to bring us liberation? So another great quote by Angela Davis, stating that jails and prisons are designed to break human beings, to convert populations into specimens in a zoo, obedient to our keepers, but dangerous to each other. And I think this is a really good quote for just paralleling the commonalities with zoos and prisons, where we're keeping different groups captive, and whatever the mainstream story is, a lot of it's really designed to just break the prisoners. Briefly, just going over the prison industrial complex in Canada, so the ideas with the prisons is that we exile offenders from our societies and reintegrate them later, at a later date, but just remembering that we're reintegrating offenders into the same society. So the society's factors in society that may have contributed to the cause of the crime or whatever harm was committed, none of that really changes. It's really emphasis on the perpetrator to change and to conform to what society expects of them. And so now there's over 15,000 prisoners in Canada, which again is the highest ever, as crime rates are declining in the last 2 decades. As well, it's extremely racist institution with 75% increase in racialized peoples in the last decade. And within Canada, it's approximately 4% are Indigenous on the national population, but they comprise 25% of the prison population. So that's a really staggering statistic just to show that it's how racist and oppressive this version of justice is. So tying this into how we talk about animal liberation, just looking at how retributive mentality has trickled into how we do animal rights. I think a good case example is looking at the practice of undercover investigations. And so just a case example there is the 2012 Butterball turkey operations with Mercy for Animals, where they would go undercover and document really horrific abuse towards animals that workers were committing. In this case, Butterball was just really violent abuse of turkeys. As a result, the North Carolina officials arrested these workers, some of the workers. And so Mercy for Animals describes this as making history, getting felony convictions for these workers committing abuse towards animals. So that's something that we should be proud of. Those are the 6 workers. And so with this, I think it's really important that we're asking ourselves, is punishing low-income racialized workers as individuals, they're individual workers, is that really helping anything with the systemic exploitation of animal abuse on this farm and on a variety of other farms? As well, has anything really changed as a result? Has Butterball stopped functioning? Has other similar corporations that work like this, has anything changed in that regard? And so, again, looking at a lot of these kind of messages with animal abuse demand justice. So it's a person in handcuffs. And the idea is that we need justice for animal abusers by imprisoning them. And I think it's a really important thing to take note of, because essentially what we're saying is that we're for promoting the rights of animals, for animal liberation, which is essentially we're trying to challenge a system of domination and violence, of hierarchy, by turning to another system of domination and violence and hierarchy as a way to achieve that. And so with this picture, this is taken at Marineland, a protest for captive marine animals, stating that only guilty offenders should be in jails and not marine animals. So this picture, as well as this one, is stating that we should be testing on guilty offenders and not animals. So those 2 images, I think it's really interesting, again, to note that what they're saying here is that it's actually not the oppression that is the problem, not keeping people captive, not conducting really horrific experiments on them, it's only who is being oppressed. And so with that, it's a really dangerous mindset, because now it becomes about the worthiness of the victim, and that's very close to victim blaming, where we're saying, actually this group deserves it for these reasons, this criteria. And with that, we're not really focusing on liberating the minds of the oppressors. And with that idea, I think it's another great quote is from Nelson Mandela. After spending 27 years in prison, walking out, this is how he describes it, is that when I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Okay, so after hopefully convincing you how horrible the retributive model is, introducing the idea of transformative justice. So with this, the background here is that with transformative, harm is understood as actually an opportunity to correct a lot of harmful social systems and relationships within our communities. It's a very non-dogmatic, it's very grassroots style of how they deal with harm in their communities. And so they put a big emphasis on recognizing that harm comes from deeper roots of oppression, and that includes a variety of different ways that they list here, with like racism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, ageism, colonialism, imperialism, speciesism, and others. And so they put a big emphasis saying that we're not going to really fix any of these examples of crimes or harm, or however you describe that, without really addressing the underlying causes of what's happening here. And so they really point out that the retributive model perpetuates these cycles of oppression by ignoring them and by colluding with them. So in practice, what they do here is some important elements is that it's a big emphasis on healing, not just for the perpetrators or the victims, but the entire communities who are affected, as well as putting emphasis on building capacity in communities to both respond to this harm and to hold perpetrators accountable. And as well, just again, working to actually change the structural patterns of what's happening and why these incidences of harm happen the way they do. So to just get some good examples, Generation 5 is a really great organization that practices transformative justice. And so what they do is, it's a national anti-violence organization who takes on issues of ending child sexual abuse. So again, it's a really extreme issue that's it's really complicated, and they think the best way of dealing with this is actually with transformative justice. And they make really clear in a lot of their materials is that individual and collective liberation is fundamentally intertwined. So you can't have one without the other. You can't be helping victims, survivors, or perpetrators without helping everyone. Another really great organization is Philly Stands Up, who is working in Philadelphia. So it's a survivor-led collective that works with perpetrators of sexual assault. And so they use a community-based system of accountability for how to do this. And so again, it's a really great way of looking at holding perpetrators accountable while still working to change their behavior. So it's completely opposite of the retributive system of trying to just push out offenders of the communities. So again, with the results, we have harm defined by communities. It's going to be local and how we understand it. Instead of being told what the laws are and what's our priority should be, it should be up to community members in those spaces to help define that. And yeah, again, it's just really important just to note that justice is found through transformation, about recognizing that things are changing. So, applying this to transformative justice to animal liberation. So I think, when we talk about veganism, it's really important to, veganism, it functions as kind of a mentality of do no harm, where we're trying to reduce suffering in our communities. And so, while it's noting that, it's cruelty-free, like that kind of label, it's extremely simplistic and very superficial version, where not only is it trying to promote social change through consumerism by what we buy and don't buy, it's propping up one system, which is like capitalism and commodification, while trying to challenge another system of domination, like speciesism. As well, it's just really, really important to note how vegan products, it still runs on a distribution model that's really destructive towards the environment and towards our communities with worker rights and just a variety of others. But you can really note the absence of that kind of critical underlying social causes that transformative justice really takes on when we just talk about veganism on its own. As well with animal rights, it's noting how, the idea of rights is saying that we should have the liberty to not be confined, harmed, or killed, but there are so many human rights already constituted and written down that are widely disrespected, and that once we recognize that the legal system is based on so much violence, we have to ask ourselves, is really creating more rights for more groups, is that really going to change anything for the better? And I think this quote from Patrice Jones is really a great way of talking about when we talk about animal rights, is that states as they are currently constituted are always violent. They were created by processes of violence and maintained by processes of violence. And this is also true about our systems of law. If what you mean by rights, which is legal rights, then you're talking about enforcement. Enforcement by who and how? Will we be sending people to prison? Will we be using guns to enforce animal rights? So I think it's just really important to talk about when we're talking about rights. If people disrespect them, how do we challenge that? So just going with this, just wrapping up with some ideas, is how we organize. So just noticing for events like this, who are here for these conversations and who aren't, and what are the reasons for this? Why aren't there? I know for a lot of events I go to, it's almost always completely homogenous for a lot of animal rights. And thinking about when I go to other events, I think if there's an emphasis towards making vegan food more accessible, I'm much more inclined to go to those events. So I think it's really important to carry that to say, if there were more gender-neutral washrooms or more accessible washrooms or more accommodations in those regards, there would be a lot more diversity and diversity of ideas. Organizing on stolen lands. So, within Turtle Island, this is all a product of colonization. So, as well with land acknowledgement, it's interesting to note that Rice University, that William Rice was a slave owner, and he made fortunes by developing railways. It's really important to remember that we're trying to organize on land that really glorifies really awful behavior. And when we're talking about intersectionality, doing it in a way that it's not tokenizing, that's not just essentially catering to other groups for the sake that they'll join animal rights mentality, but actually doing it in a way that it's solidarity and active allyship. And so asking what we organize against. So I think the ideas of transformative justice really make that clear, is that we're going beyond just the symptoms of what these problems are and not challenging brand names or workers, but actually underlying causes. And what we're organizing for. So what are our goals and why are we here? I think you can never really overthink those sort of questions. I think good examples are Haudenosaunee. They talk about seven generations from our ancestors, 7 generations back, as well as seven generations for future generations. So, when they're making decisions, they're thinking about what did our ancestors, what would they want, and what would our future generations want. And Generation 5 talking about ending child sex abuse in 100 years. So it's very long-term. And again, recognizing that this is a process and not a destination. So the process is equally, if not more important than what we're going for. So where do we start? I think these are some good points to start off of, is just, again, recognizing from the beginning that we all cause harm. So we should be calling out behavior that we think is problematic and calling in people in a way that is not pushing them out of these conversations, but actually engaging with them in a way that's more constructive. Starting more dialogue about the roots of harm in a way that's, sometimes I feel like it's more important to unlearn a lot of things before we start learning things, which is a lot of just assumptions and stereotypes and privileges that we're really taught by our societies. And again, not endorsing any particular strategy, because again, transformative justice makes really clear that it's very community-based, so what works in one community is not going to work in another. And the last quote is from Octavia Butler, saying that all social change is speculative fiction, because we've never seen a world without poverty, never seen a world with total equality, never seen a world without prisons. Therefore, activism is speculative fiction. It's visionary fiction because we are writing a world where we've never seen, but a world we like to live in. It's hard and unapologetic, but it's hopeful because it can cause us to move, wakes us up, and shows us that change is possible. So I think it's important, just again, to remember that when we're talking about transformative justice, it can be really intimidating to think about developing a whole new system of justice. But I think that's stuff we're doing all the time when we're doing activism. It's just imagining, and it's not yet here, which is something can be really great if we look at it like that. And that is it. So thank you.